We are human beings, not political abstractions. Sounds obvious, no? And yet, I think we all know how often we live up to that ideal. An ideal that is at the heart of today's guest's message. Chloé Valdary is a writer, thinker, and entrepreneur, founder of Theory of Enchantment, a diversity and inclusion program that aims to remind us of our shared humanity, to help us create workplaces where we can unite around shared purpose and embrace our differences with love and compassion. We explore how love can show up at work and so much more during our conversation. We had some technical issues that affect both sound and video quality, but I hope you can take in enough to appreciate the profound nature of Chloé's teachings. We talk about how our efforts to discharge deep personal pain are often at the heart of conflict in the workplace. We talk about the vulnerability of nonviolent communication and how it can strengthen trust within a relationship. And we talk about how the best conversations at work are like jam sessions, each person truly present and feeding off each other, creating something we could never create on our own. These kinds of conversations are my jam, going deep on important stuff that makes you feel something. I hope you feel it too. Okay, Chloé Valdary, welcome to the DesuckifyWork Podcast.
Thanks for having me. I love the name of your podcast.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I'm trying to have some fun with it. And I'd love for people to get a chance to know you. I've known of you for a little bit. I've heard you on some other podcasts. I've listened to your own podcast, and I followed you on Twitter and LinkedIn. But you're doing some really interesting work, and I'd love for people to get a sense of what that work is and maybe a bit of how you came to be doing that work.
Awesome. Yeah, I can talk a little bit about that. So I have a startup called Theory of Enchantment, and the basic premise of the startup is to teach people how to love. Mm-hmm. And what that means is we primarily partner with other companies who are trying to create a culture of inclusion and belonging, which really boils down to creating a culture of trust in the workplace. Mm-hmm. Employees will go through our workshops. They will go through our online course. And by the end of their time with us, they will have emerged more compassionate, more open-hearted, more with the capacity to be vulnerable and bring that way of being to the workplace.
Wow. Well, that sounds like a pretty wonderful state. I mean, how has your experience been so far? Have people been taking that journey with you?
Yeah, it's been really good. And I should say that I am as much of a student. I am a instructor or teacher of the Theory of Enchantment. Okay. It's been really, really cool to see, both from the pedagogical perspective and from the entrepreneurial perspective. Mm-hmm. From the perspective of pedagogy, there are three principles of the Theory of Enchantment teaches. Mm-hmm. The first principle is treat people like human beings, not equal distractions. Okay. The second principle is criticize to uplift and empower, not tear down or destroy. Mm-hmm. And then the third principle is try to root everything you do in love and compassion. Mm-hmm. So these are the three principles we bring to our partners. And then there are practices that go along with all of these principles, at least in our full course. Pedagogy. Okay. Which is, like I said, I'm a student of it. I am someone who's also trying to learn how to love. So I practice the Theory of Enchantment in as much as I teach it. Mm-hmm. The entrepreneurial side, which is super fascinating, which is, trying to figure out a way to build systems that will easily bring Theory of Enchantment into different ecosystems across different industries, given the diversity of really the infinite diversity of industries that exist in the world. And we create a product that can scale not only up, but across as many ecosystems as possible. And that's been really fun to figure out the puzzle of that.
Well, if you crack that code, I would love for you to share it, because I know in my own entrepreneurial journey, that is tricky, right? To kind of understand who your audience can be and then figure out how you can connect to that audience. And I think that could be something we dive into a little more here. I think I'd love to start more on on the pedagogy side, because I think when people hear about what you do, and you describe it as, I think on your site at times as an anti-racism practice, but then also at times as more of a diversity and inclusion practice. And I think all of those things obviously can link together. What is different about the approach that you're taking than what some people may have experienced? A lot of people have probably gone through programs at work or even outside of work. And what are some of the distinctions that people might see with yours?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we do market as an anti-racism practice or diversity, equity, and inclusion practice. And what distinguishes other practices that are out there, I would say, are two things. But number one is that we perceive or view supremacy as this sort of mystical thing that only a few people are capable of imposing or acting out. We perceive supremacy as a coping mechanism that human beings across the human species for as a way to deal with pain. And that insight actually comes from some of James Baldwin's observations, that people will cling to their bigotries because they low-key suspect that once bigotry is gone, they will be forced to deal with pain. And so I would say that as a species, and that's another thing that distinguishes us. I think we have this perspective ultimately that comes from looking at human beings as a species, right? As a species, we have coping mechanisms to deal with the chaos of the unknown, the chaos of not having our needs met. So, for example, I don't have my needs met. I don't have food, water, shelter, security. But to be more even more sort of complex, if you don't have access to a feeling of love or feeling of belonging or feeling of friendship, feeling of self-esteem. Have those satisfied. I don't have the proper tools in my wheelhouse to deal with not having those needs met. Then we'll overcompensate, adopting a very simplistic worldview. That's something like all the people who look like me are good, and all the people who don't look like me, or all the people who think like me are good, and all the people who don't look like me are bad. Right? You can drop any sort of sentence into it. You can see the pattern. But when I do, ultimately, what I am trying to do is to cope with the pain of not having my needs met. So Theory of Enchantment goes in and says, well, let's go to the core of what's actually happening here. Unpack what it means to be a human being. Let's unpack all these needs that we have to have in order to thrive. Let's try to, because there are going to be times when I don't feel self-esteem, right? There are going to be times when I do feel insecure. This is what it means to be human. What are the strategies I can reach for in order to deal with that? What are the more healthy, holistic strategies I can reach for in order to deal with that? And projecting insecurities onto others in order to feel superior. And there are a whole strategies, let's say some traditions actually, that come from the collective consciousness of the human species. Away from wisdom tradition, Stoicism, which is to deal with the feelings of helplessness. Stoicism actually came out of a time in ancient Greece where people were experiencing the profound feeling of the loss of home and had to deal with that. And Stoicism was like a technology that developed out of that. All the way to, how do I handle parental baggage, right? How do I aware that a lot of the thought processes or the paradigms that I bring with me into the world have been passed down unconsciously from my caretakers, from my parents. Conscious awareness to that, so that if I find myself in conflict with someone, and for some reason, I'm actually brought back psychologically to a time where I was with my parents and in the present moment, talking to the person or perceiving that person as my parents, how to bring that conscious awareness so that I don't respond in an adversarial, distrusting, untrusting manner. So like I said, there's hundreds, really dozens to hundreds of actually different practices that we can to deal with these insecurities. And Theory of Enchantment offered the ecology of those practices to folks in the workplace to help them become more compassionate and open-minded and trusting, fundamentally trusting themselves and trusting each other.
Wow. I mean, my first instinct is it sounds amazing. And what I wonder is if you walk into somebody's workplace and you bring this up, but at the same time, there is already some conflict within this organization, and there might be some people who are feeling slighted by the organization in some way. You talked about the idea of supremacy, and some people might feel that that's present in their workspace. Sure. And you're bringing this very compassionate look at like that person who's acting that way, or this system that's acting that way, is based in something much, much more rooted in their own personal pain and their own lack of feelings of love. How do you crack open the door just enough to get the people at least open to hearing that message when on the surface is frustration or anger or disappointment and those kinds of things?
Yeah, I mean, this is a great question. I would say that the way that the systems work in terms of bringing Theory of Enchantment into different workplaces is that usually an executive team or a team that has some sort of buying power will make the decision to like host a workshop or host an event, either only with the C-suite level management team or a more diverse team of C-suite folks and non-C-suite folks. It really depends upon the context of whatever given organization we're working with. But I would say that in a situation where there's already conflict, oftentimes the reason why we're being brought in the first place is because of that. Sometimes it's best to just work with a small contingent of people initially.
Okay.
So we can help acclimate themselves to be able to realize all these things that I just said. Let's say it's an team, so that when they go to their, let's say, team of managers, where let's say the managers do perceive that executive team as I don't know, exploitative or just not managing well.
Yep.
The C-suite team is then able to actually hear the people who are in that assistant team them without, taking personal offense, without feeling like they need to shut down and get defensive. This is step-by-step acclimating different teams to this new way of being. They can go into the conflict in their own ecosystem and handle it appropriately. At the time, handling it appropriately means learning things like nonviolent communication, right? One of my favorite things to teach is there's this beautiful point that Brene Brown makes in her TED Talk, Power of Vulnerability, where she says that the way that blame is described in the research that she did is a way to discharge pain. And I think that's really, really profound. We can tune our ear, both professionally and interpersonally, right? If we can tune our ears to hear blame, not personally, as a way to discharge pain. The person is blaming us or blaming someone else or whatever. It's just them discharging pain. And actually, as human beings, we need safe spaces to discharge pain.
Absolutely.
Hear that. We can hear that. Let's say I'm on the receiving end of blame. If I can hear that, it's very hard, by the way.
I
don't want to, bypass that point. But I train myself to really hear someone blaming me as a way to discharge their pain and respond to the pain point instead of getting distracted by the blame. I can actually create a space of not only dialogue, but the ability to have that other person feel seen and feel heard and move forward and find a solution to whatever conflict. This takes so much practice. Our limbic system, on an evolutionary perspective, right? Our limbic system, that fight or flight mode in the back of our brains, millions of years old.
Yes.
And the prefrontal cortex, one of our brains is only a couple thousand years old, 100,000 years old, something like that. So we have to really practice. It's like doing a rep. It's like exercising. There's no substitute for exercising when it comes to this sort of stuff. But that's a more long-winded response to your question.
No, I love that though, because I think, first off, I love the notion of starting small in an organization. I think that's really smart. Like getting buy-in and then getting people to understand enough of the practice that they can then share it and be open to the questions and the potential, even if conflict comes up. Like that's great. But the deeper notion of this idea that we're discharging pain, that thing from Brené Brown, I've heard similar in some things that I've explored. I follow this practice called positive intelligence, and it has a similar insight. But what I find is that limbic brain is so powerful that even if I intellectually can grasp that concept outside of the context of a conversation, when the conversation comes, it's so activated, right? So what do you recommend for people as part of that practice to get the more compassionate part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, to start to be at least at the same level of timing so that it can sort of intercept that immediate reaction? Because I think of this, even like you said, interpersonally. It's like somebody blames you for something and you just go into defensive mode, right? And then afterwards I'll be like, oh, well, that person was hurt. But that's not doing me any good. How does that happen simultaneously?
Well, I will just say that it's okay that it happened, even a split second after or 5 minutes after. Like, I would not encourage you to blame yourself for not having happen simultaneously. One of the things my therapist has told me is like, when I'm being annoyed and frustrated with my own sort of like lack of simultaneity, I mean that the limbic system is millions of years old.
Yes.
The idea that I'm going to like successfully override my own limbic system. I mean, I think this is a call to humility on some level. But to your question, I will break down a fun aspect of the word enchantment for a second. So, called the Theory of Enchantment. When I think of the word enchantment, I think of this idea of being delighted. I think that this idea of opening up to the infinite complexity of the world, of myself, and of others. When I think of enchantment, I think of sort of like not enlightenment, which is blinding light, but I think of this sort of sparkle, this sense of sparkle that I experience when I encounter myself and the world. Another interesting tidbit about enchantment is its relationship to music. So, I see you're wearing a Bon Jovi shirt.
Yes.
There's a guitar in the backhand there. I as well. I love singing, love producing.
Nice.
And so, in Spanish, encantar means to sing. Right? Encanto, beautiful word, also Disney movie, song, right? Enchant also means to sing something into being or to sing something into existence. And there is a tuning here in the word itself. There's a sort of like an invitation to tune in, a listening word to what's actually happening internally. And so I would say the direct answer to your question is we want to actually be able to train our ear to tune in to what's happening to us thematically in that moment. So in the moment when I'm being blamed, I feel a rush of hot energy belly up.
Yeah.
I feel heated. That's why we say I feel heated, right? It's not conceptual language, right? It's not conceptual language. It's actually deeply somatic, right? And so I think part of the practice is actually practicing tuning into what's happening in the body. And number two, and this is where there's vulnerability, is actually stating what's happening. And that's where nonviolent communication is.
Okay.
Right? And so I can tune myself into noticing what's happening in that moment and also articulating what's happening in that moment. And it'll be, intercepting it.
Mm.
Because I'm simply being present with what is.
Mm-hmm.
I am like a jam session, really.
Mm-hmm.
I'm from New Orleans, the birthplace of jazz. So
nice.
I'm very much tuned into that sort of language.
Yeah.
Like can enter into relationship with myself and with the world in such a way that I am jamming at all. I am alive and present with what is. It's just sort of like a free flow interaction. So there's, somatic practice, like deep breath work that goes with that ability to tune into what's happening. But that is, I think, very fundamental actually to the question that you're asking and to the puzzle that we're essentially trying to solve for.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things jumped out at me there. You talked about when you feel that heat, articulating that. So what does that look like? Are you literally saying like, I'm feeling heated right now? I'm feeling activated or something by this conversation? Or how do you do that in a way that is, not going to activate something else from somebody else,
Well, so I would say, firstly, understand that you cannot control everything and you're not in control of everything.
And that's a good point.
Yeah, there's no guarantee that as you articulate what's happening for you that you're not going to activate, right?
Yeah, fair.
Remember that as human beings, we carry sort of like the unfolding of processes that have come before. So if I'm talking to you and for whatever reason, when you're talking to me, you're experiencing some event that happened with your mother 5 years ago, I'm not going to be able to, control for that.
Yeah, I get that. Yeah.
So that's really important to keep in mind. But I think like to your question, it's like nonviolent communication helps us with this because nonviolent communication trains us to essentially express what is happening in a way where we can take ownership of our feelings. So I might say something like, let's say if I'm feeling heated, I might say something like, I'm feeling heated, I'm feeling defensive. So for renaming all of those things, again, it's very vulnerable practice, right? I'm feeling defensive. I'm feeling like I want to shut down and don't want to have this conversation at all. And then, and this is sort of where more pointed NVC comes in. It's like, let's say that let's say the source of the conflict, I'm just making this up, is that you haven't been consistent in your communication, right? And so I will say something to you like, when you don't communicate with me consistently, I feel small. And the reason why I feel small is because as a human being, I need to feel connected, right? I need to feel connection with people in my life that I care about. And when I don't feel that connection, I feel small. Notice, I'm not blaming you. I'm telling you what is present for me, right? I'm just being honest with what is present for me, and I'm not blaming you. And so it's that subtlety, right? The same subtlety that goes into playing pentatonic scale, is in like the subtlety that I am, and that Theory of Enchantment is like calling us to or summoning us to in that.
Well, yeah, I can even.
After.
Go ahead.
Sorry.
I was just.
After I explain well, I might ask something of you, right? I might ask you how to feel to hear that, right? What's present for you?
Yeah.
What's alive for you, right? And then we're jamming.
Yeah.
Then we're in a jam session, and then we're in that singing like or song like quality of enchantment.
And I think that is particularly intriguing to me for a couple of reasons. One, as a musician, it just connects to me. But I think as you demonstrated a little bit of that nonviolent communication, it's like you're not, I think what some people might think when they hear that is, oh, I'm just going to be quote unquote nice. And and that sometimes means avoidance, right? You're being very direct. When you say this thing, I feel this thing, and that makes me feel like, this way because of this need that's not being, met for me. And then you can then bring it back to the other person and go, how does that make you feel? So you're being very honest and direct, but you're also not, and I would imagine this might be more violent communication, where it would just be like, push it right back at the person and go, you're an expletive, and why are you being so nasty right now, right? So I think there's something really interesting there. And I think just the notion, the framing of life or conversations in this idea of a jam session is just, it allows it to not feel sort of loaded to me. It allows it to feel like a process of co-creation, which is really nice. Am I getting that right?
Yeah. And I want to emphasize that point, because all great products in a business X from co-creation.
Right.
You can see how this might scaffold onto the question of how do we build a great product for customers to serve their needs. Much one-to-one needed to that question.
What's interesting there too is, I think when some people have experienced any kind of, DEI training or similar, it can feel very much like it's bolted on to everything else. It's not integrated into the work you do. And what you just described is something really interesting, which is, we're not simply giving you a thing to either check a box and or to focus to this thing that lies out here. It's like, if you can learn to be together in this way, in this jam session kind of mindset, it allows you to create more things, to work better together, it will enhance your business in whatever way that shows up. That feels really interesting. Do people resonate with that thought when you bring this into them?
Oh, for sure. We've had folks who have taken our online course who have said that, when I interacted with this customer who told me, who came in yelling that they needed, something, I immediately went, okay, tell me what you need and how can I do it? Like there was there was no, or there was less of an automatic defensive posture. The person has needs. Let me see how I might service to those needs. Folks have told us that they are able to manage conversations between, top level directors and managers more easily, or give feedback in a more constructive way because of their going through. So we've seen direct impact from folks doing these practices in the workplace.
I can imagine, and I think when you layer in the notion of human difference, right, and the ways we define that, right, because I think we define that in sometimes what I would say are simplistic but still relevant ways, whether that's race or ethnicity or culture or gender. These are things that are alive in our world. So I understand why we do it. But does that process of getting people into this state of more of a flowing kind of jam-like state, can it break down some of those challenges if somebody's coming in with a perspective of, I don't know how to connect with somebody who's different from me, or I have some sense of difference that blocks me there. Does this break through that?
Your question reminds one of we call the missions in the Theory of Enchantment online course, which is basically about noticing how we project and assume roles onto other people and onto ourselves. Actually, we assign roles onto other people and onto ourselves. So a very easy example is the other day I was on the plane and there was someone next to me who I perceived as a member of Gen Z. And I'm a millennial. My sisters are my little for Gen Z, so I have to
got it.
my brain all of a sudden started like assuming things about the person sitting next to me because I assumed they were Gen Z. And then I went into the Theory of Enchantment practice where I sort of zoomed out and saw that I was assigning this role to this person and therefore assigning a role to myself. And there's nothing wrong with this. As because we are conscious that this is what we're doing, right? All the practice is bringing conscious awareness and attention to the fact that this is what we're doing. Once I became conscious of it, it's not as if I completely dispensed with the role that I was assigning to the person or assigning to myself, but rather that the role more loosely held. So I didn't find myself over-identifying with this role that I had projected onto her or onto my And so I think that's really the direction that Theory of Enchantment points people towards, is to be able to see really the power of creation that we have as human beings and how we can hinder ourselves when we so rigidly hold certain identities. And also just to be able to see, like, we create these identities. And there's nothing wrong, again, with creating these identities.
Right.
Conscious of the fact that that's what we're... And so that's a bit conceptual, but I have to say, for myself personally, I feel a somatic difference when I shift between those two modes, when I shift from like unconscious projection to conscious, and therefore I'm able to see like the unfolding complexity of the person in front of my eyes. And I think that sort of to the present moment, and so I don't have to like feel so feel so inclined to over-identify how I'm identifying in that moment.
Yeah, I think that term loosely held is really interesting, right? Because I think some people might hear when you bring up the idea of the stories we have around whatever identities we're creating and living in. There is some instinct for some, and some people may even say this, like, just ditch it, like get rid of it, and just like, in its simplest form, like it's like we're all just people and blah blah blah. And I think there's some merit to that thought, but I also think identity is real, and we need to create identities to move through the world. But if they can be slightly more loosely held, like you said, and be conscious about that, then you not only step out of your own story a little bit, but you then start to see somebody beyond the story that you've created for them. And that's when you have a chance of starting to have that little jam session happening versus being these kind of avatars for whatever you want it to be, just clashing.
Right. And you can see that you can choose to change the story, which is very powerful, right? There's a lot of power in that. A lot of agency in that. There's a great deal of autonomy in that. And I do love that. I think that the term autonomy is actually related to the autonomic nervous system. So it's an embodied word.
Yeah.
And I will say that this is a challenge, because I know that I know how I get stuck in my own stories, right? Like there are certain stories that I have had in the past where it felt like, it would feel devastating to get rid of those stories. It would feel devastating to hold those stories loosely. Well, if I let go of some of those stories, or if I loosely hold them, then who am I? Then how can I know who I am? And if I don't know who I am, then the chaos of the unknown is now flooding into my world. And how do I deal with that? Maybe I'll reach for that easy heuristic that tells me that all the people who think like me are good and all the people who don't think like me are bad. So we're back to the supremacist set. So I don't want to play how difficult it is actually to get to this state and to constantly return to the state where you're how everything is constantly coming into being and constantly going out of being in a sort of like metaphysical way. I find it far more satisfying to be able to come into that. And there is, I should say, discomfort. Like you will encounter discomfort because we are not used to having our assumptions challenged in this way. We're not used to. I certainly wasn't used to it before I created Theory of Enchantment. And we are not used to, we're not used to being confronted with this question: who are you? It's actually question. And so many Disney movies, which we reference a lot in Theory of Enchantment. So many Disney movies, the main character experiences like a turn of events, if you will, when asked by a character, "Who are you?" Right? Who you are. Right? You think of Simba in The Lion King, where he asks him, "Who are you?" Right? It's such a profound question. And in a way, we're trying to surface that question, hold that question up as the base point around which we can all actually meet. Because going back to your earlier question about like what distinguishes us from other, DEI programs, fact that many DEI programs start with certain assumptions about, what it means to be Black, what it means to be white, what it means to be male, what it means to be female, what it means to be straight, what it means to be, so forth. And we start from the question, what does it mean to be a human? Regardless of your background, socioeconomic status, gender, whatever, to be human. Let's go to that fundamental base point, and then we can actually move. And I perceive it essentially the same way that I perceive when I'm watching a show like Planet Earth. And I'm falling in love with nature, and I'm seeing all these things, the trees, the birds, the bats, the whales. I am mesmerized, and I'm trying to get people to realize that like that's us as well. We should be mesmerized by the human experience of what it means to be a human being.
Yeah, I love that perspective. I mean, I think we forget sometimes just how special it is to be human, right? And how much we share that. There's something very universal about that experience, and there's something, it is magical is a word I would use, right? It's like we get to live and be and experience all of the beauty in the world, and all of the pain and all that stuff. But so I love that you start there, and then you can kind of, so there's some point of connection for people, and then it's like, okay, if there are differences through however those show up, at least we recognize the value and the specialness of the human experience that we're living in together, and that feels like at least it has the potential to create some unity that you can work with when there might be potential divisions among people. So have people connected with that idea when you bring that up?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, it really, we begin our workshops with this fundamental question. We have people engage in a practice that we call the Who Am I practice, and we tell people to put a number on, and for every answer that comes to them, say thank you, like express gratitude, and also remember to express gratitude for the qualities of yourself that you don't like. That part is really, really essential. And that really, it's funny. So strange to do that, right? It's so weird to do that because we have been conditioned not to be grateful for those aspects of that we dislike. There's sort of a paradox, right? But it's like, if you can be grateful for the whole of the human experience, right? Gratitude. You can come to a place where you're able to express gratitude for, yes, the experience of joy that you had when you walked outside and saw autumn, but also the experience of loneliness that you had, and that you found out that, your friends were all out of town, and you, or like, if you can actually get present enough, and we're really talking about cultivating the capacity for profound presence, which is, I think, increasingly scarce in our if you can get present enough and almost quiet enough, right, to the beauty of it all, including the beauty, yes, of joy, but also the beauty of sorrow, and yes, the beauty of pain that underpins all of it, you will actually be able to see the illusory nature with which you have projected certain things, both yourself and others. You will be able to see that you can choose a different story, right? You can choose different projections. You can choose different meaning. Is part of unique, I would say, specialness of what it means to be human. We can actually choose.
Yeah. I think it can be really easy to feel like you have no choice. And I think in some ways, modern life makes it even harder because we have so few moments where we can actually feel present because things are just zipping by us and we're just trying to like sort of survive in a sense mentally, that I think we don't always have just the brief moments of actually feeling present enough to recognize that the next moment is a choice. We're just feeling a little bit swept up in all of it. And so I think a practice that can help you just step back for a second and realize that next step forward is in fact a choice is huge. And I can see in the workplace, it's the same thing. I mean, we just get caught up in, we go from meeting to meeting to meeting. We go from conversation to conversation. We go from request to request, deadline to deadline. And it's 6 months later and you just go, what the hell did we all just do? So if you can incorporate that practice in the workplace, I can see the profound impact it could have, especially if everybody is in it with you and everybody's doing it in their own way and trying to find those moments so that you have the opportunity to get into more of that jam session mode, as opposed to this just kind of tsunami of life just picking you up and taking you and throwing you and depositing you wherever it does, you know? Yeah. It's interesting. One of the words that you bring up very early on in your site and even today is this word love. And I think of how, people may struggle when they hear that word, right? Especially in a work setting. It's like, how can I bring love to work? How do you get people to see that word differently so that they can embrace that idea?
That's a good question. I really don't try to convince people.
Yeah.
Like everything I'm saying to you with what I essentially say to them. And I think the impression that they get is that, oh, this is love. I want to be a part of that. And they know that they need that.
Yes.
They understand that. They are in touch with themselves and understand that. It's so, I don't want to overstate it, but I think that in many facets of our lives, it's so lacking. We just launched a end of year holiday sale for our online course. And one of the things that we spoke about in the copy was, one of the things I spoke about in the copy was like how difficult it is to go home to your family. And, if you have a family where you don't die on everything, and you're like, dreading the fact that you're going to go home and you know that the conversations or topics are going to come up where you're going to feel heated.
Yeah.
You're going to feel anxious. You're not going to know how to, it's like, that is the residue that we're, of course, bringing into everywhere, whether it's the workplace, whether it's the personal space. None of these things are compartments.
Yeah.
Try to delude ourselves in your compartments. They're all impacting and impacted by each other. So how do you bring this practice, of love, everything you don't love what you're building at work, if you don't love what your, the services that you're putting together, the goal of the company that you're all a part of, you don't love it, it's not going to happen.
Yeah, no, it's true. And I think we, like you said, we sort of delude ourselves into thinking that we don't need that in the workspace, that that we can get by with just kind of being okay in the workspace. And I think my belief, and part of why I probably started this podcast, is I believe it can be so much more, but I do think it takes that. I think you need to feel that sense of love and that sense of inspiration and that sense of passion. And then hopefully that creates this sense within whoever you're working with of shared, commitment and shared love towards whatever you're trying to build. Cause that's when suddenly that magical stuff starts to happen, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And you enter into flow state, right? At work.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yes.
And then it's not interpreted as going from meaning to meaning. You are, yes, it's hard. Yes, it's grinding, but there's a thrill to it.
Yeah.
Because you love it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It's such a different feeling when you are in that flow state, and it is, it reminds me of something you describe, I think, at some point yourself as an artist, and I love that notion, and what it makes me think is, as we're talking through all of this, it's like to not just survive, but thrive in sort of a modern world and in a modern workplace. Do we all need to be artists? Do we all need to see ourselves that way so that we can kind of enter more of these flow states, have more of this jam with the people we're working with? Do you think that that's true?
I think that's a great question. And I do think that that's true. I mean, when I think of the term artist, because I'm associating it with artisan and what it means to be an artisan or craftsman.
Mm-hmm.
There's a relationship between what you are creating and you. Mm. And it's not, it's not this sort of like, you're not divorced from it.
Yes.
You, because it is your creation. Mm-hmm. I think that's enough. So when people feel like they don't have a choice, they just understand the profound impact that they have on the world. They can't see, they can't feel it. And they can't see that every day, every hour they are creating. They're in the process of creation. They are being and they are creating simultaneously. And if we can't wake up to that fact, we can't if we can't see that fact, we're good. Of what it means to be human, which goes back to that first principle: treat people like human beings, not political abstractions. It's a beautiful, almost devotional relationship that one can have with their earth. And I think that is what art have, that's what craftsmen have. And we bring about that orientation into the workplace more explicitly.
Yeah, I think that I can imagine it would be a very profound change if people were able to adopt that story for themselves, loosely held, but there, I think it would be really interesting. And it brings me to a couple of the questions I like to ask to kind of wrap up. I feel like you're starting to describe some of this stuff, but I always ask, like, if you could just wave a magic wand and kind of make work not suck, like, for people, what would that be, right? Like, what does that world look like if it's a less suckified world?
Yeah, I think it is sort of imbuing into people, or more, I don't want to describe a top-down approach, like emergent, but more emergent development within human beings, awakening to this sensibility, to this sensitivity, which is an artist-like sensitivity, or relationship with the work that they are doing, with the product they are producing, right? With the thing that they are creating. It can have a more artistic relationship with what they are creating and or who they are servicing. And if they could actually hold their own complexity and see their own complexity with a sense of awe, see their own beauty, they will be able to see beauty in others and to be beauty in others, and bring that sensibility and sensitivity to the workplace. In the workplace, I mean, there's no telling what would happen in the workplace in terms of the profound sense of meaning that people encounter. It's, spending a lot of spend the majority of their life in the workplace. And no space for love in the work. You better hope that you love what you do. The majority of your life.
I fully agree with that. I love that word awe, like seeing the awe in what you bring. I think that like being in awe of who you are and what you bring is a wonderful shift. I know we got to wrap things up here. One thing I ask of people, and you don't need to do this, but I throw it out there. I do a lot of sound effects on my show. I do a lot of cat sounds. Are you game for donating a sound effect that you're able to make? Do you have any, like, it could be music, it could be anything. But for me, again, it's usually goofy sounds, but it could be anything. If you're game, great. If not, no worries.
Like there's no rules for the sound?
No rules. It can be, it could be anything. Yeah.
I'll just use my voice.
Okay.
I'll just use my voice.
I like that. It feels like it has an interesting mix of like almost a little bit of jazz sound, but almost a little bit of a cartoon like music when somebody's kind of meandering through, like tiptoeing through. I don't know if what that is specifically. Was that a specific tune?
No, I just pulled that out.
You just pulled that out? I love it. That's awesome. Well, it will probably show up somewhere in the intro to our episode, just so you know.
Awesome.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll try to find the right spot for it. Lastly, before we go, I just want to give people a chance to know how can they find you and learn more about the work you're doing?
Yeah, so people can go to theoryofenchantment.com to find out more about the company. They can follow us at Enchant Theory on Twitter or Theory of Enchantment on Instagram. Follow my Instagram at Chloé Valdary.
Okay, awesome. Well, I'll put all of that in the show notes as well, and maybe if there's anything else I can add there that's helpful, I will. And thank you so much, Chloé, for coming on. I felt like we went on a fun journey, and I feel more optimistic about how we can help people create more of a jazz-like environment in the workplace where we're all jamming together and creating stuff that we truly love.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Chloé. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone, for tuning in to the DesuckifyWork Podcast. And thanks to Chloé for being an enlightening and engaging guest. You can follow Chloé and Theory of Enchantment on LinkedIn, on X, and at theoryofenchantment.com. You should also check out her podcast, The Heart Speaks, where she talks with philosophers, artists, writers, and academics about the big issues impacting our culture. And if you'd like to know more about the impact my work can have for you or your business, check out thepuddingfactory.net, follow the podcast on Substack and YouTube, and subscribe to the DesuckifyWork newsletter at tjbennett.substack.com. Have a wonderful holiday season, everyone. Bye.